Welcome to Duty to Report. Learning objectives. The reporting of unprofessional conduct and preventing the escalation of misconduct is where cannabis industry professionals are required to exercise courage, integrity, and decisiveness when they have a duty to report. When a cannabis industry professional becomes aware of possible misconduct, they will immediately report the incident to the management or directly to government regulators. Learn how licensed professionals who observe serious misconduct have a duty to report and take appropriate action to cause the misconduct to cease immediately. The fact that the management is present and not taking appropriate action to stop the misconduct does not relieve other coworkers present from this obligation. Licensed cannabis professionals may not be peace officers or have the authority of law enforcement, yet they still carry the responsibility to report and prevent misconduct. Occupation, experience, rank, or tenure are not factors in knowing the difference between right and wrong, and they do not provide an excuse for failing to take appropriate action. Learning objectives. Cannabis industry integrity. Licensed professional duty. Medical use responsibility. Self-duty to report requirements. Patient and caregiver duties. Duty to report conduct. Management responsibilities. Corrective action measures. Community relations. Duty to report practices. Anonymous reporting. Duty to report summary. Cannabis industry integrity. The cannabis industry expects licensed individuals to possess a high degree of integrity, so anyone who is perceived, justifiably or not, to be allowing or concealing unprofessional misconduct impairs the trust of the public. When anyone sees unprofessional conduct, they should be aware of their duty to report responsibility, to freely and truthfully notify when there are acts of misconduct. This is essential if a licensed operation or government regulators aim to maintain the trust of the local community, if it becomes necessary to prevent the escalation of any unprofessional misconduct. The duty to report unprofessional conduct is an ethical responsibility that's imposed on licensed professionals in the cannabis industry, which makes them responsible for notifying government regulators and their management team when an illegal violation occurs in the workplace. With very few exceptions, a licensed professional who becomes aware of a coworker who has committed an action that violates their rules of ethical conduct, then there is a duty to report that individual so legal action can be taken against them for any of the following. Unprofessional conduct. This means conduct that is detrimental to the best interests of the public, including conduct that endangers the health, safety, or welfare of a patient or client. Such conduct will include the following acts: coercion, intimidation, harassment, sexual harassment, improper use of private health information, threats, degradation of character, indecent or obscene conduct, and theft. Dishonesty means any action to include making any statement that deceives, misrepresents, or misleads, or be a party to, or an accessory to any fraudulent or deceitful practice, or transaction in the dispensation of medical cannabis, or operation or conduct of licensed operations. Anyone who suspects the unprofessional conduct of a coworker is not required to immediately have a duty to report based only on suspicion, nor are they required to investigate to confirm or dispel their concerns, since the coworkers must exhibit unprofessional conduct first. The presumption of innocence is a legal principle that every person accused of any unprofessional conduct is considered innocent until proven guilty. Under the presumption of innocence, the duty to report burden of proof is the responsibility of government regulators, along with the individual who reported a coworker's conduct must present compelling evidence of their behavior. Licensed professional duty. All licensed cannabis operations are responsible for monitoring for suspicious medical cannabis, recommendations from medical professionals, unusual usage by patients, or any questionable legal use of cannabis in general. You are required to notify the management team upon discovery of cannabis theft or loss, including anything in transit that was either shipped from or do the operation along with notifying. Government regulators by telephone immediately upon discovery of the theft or loss. Law enforcement who have authority over the jurisdiction where the theft or loss occurred. To regulate cannabis in the interests of consumer safety, government regulators must be equipped with all relevant information that allows them to operate effectively. Some of the information that is pertinent to consumer safety and protection is not immediately available to government regulators, many times in the course of their existing programs and functions. As such, boards rely upon other professional individuals and licensed entities to submit this information as it's identified and deemed necessary. Any cannabis thefts or unexplained losses will be immediately reported to government regulators in writing. This is irrespective of whether it is recovered or the responsible parties are identified and action taken against them. Written reports should be provided within 48 hours following the discovery of such theft or loss. The written report should include business name, physical address, and license number, cannabis amount and product type, lost or stolen, circumstances surrounding loss or theft, date loss or theft discovered, person who discovered loss or theft, person responsible, if known, for loss or theft, and any other information that the individual believes might help establish the cause of the loss or theft. Many times, an exemption may be obtained from government regulators if the licensed operation has a sufficient reason why a written notification cannot be completed and sent to government regulators within 5 days. This exemption request should be submitted in writing to government regulators before the 5th day passes or ends. Medical use responsibility. Upon discovery of any unlawful cannabis use and fraudulent medical recommendations by any licensed healthcare practitioner, it is the professional's responsibility to immediately notify law enforcement authorities and government regulators when there are suspected illegal activities. Every licensed professional in the cannabis industry who knows, from direct observation or objective evidence, of any unprofessional conduct or illegal violations by a coworker will report such conduct to the government regulators once learning or witnessing the alleged violations. The following is required to be reported upon: any conduct indicating addiction, or if they're suspected to be abusing alcohol, drugs, or other chemical substances along with being impaired, physically or mentally, to the degree that makes the individual unfit to carry out their professional duties. A licensed professional does not have the duty to report if they become aware of any condition as a result of learning about it from the treatment for the individual of their pre-existing condition. They had access to an individual's protected health information, PHI. Any violation attempts to violate or aid and to abet in breaking any laws. The behavior of a licensed individual constitutes unprofessional conduct or dishonesty. Confidential reporting and proceedings. The identity of the professional making a report on a coworker will remain confidential. The professional who had the duty to report may be required to testify in a disciplinary proceeding for the coworker's conduct or violations, but this will be done without disclosing the professional who reported the individual coworker. Self-duty to report requirements. Licensed professionals have a duty to report on themselves when they have any criminal conviction, except for minor traffic violations such as parking violations, speeding tickets, and violations such as failure to obey a red light, failure to use a turn signal, or expired registration. Convicted or pled guilty. Is subject to a judicial finding of eligibility for intervention in lieu of conviction, or the equivalent in another jurisdiction after the individual is deemed eligible. Rehabilitation program. The professional is granted entry into a diversion program, deferred prosecution program, or the equivalent after the individual is granted entry into a program, and any felony arrest. In addition, professionals must notify government regulators of any disciplinary licensing or registration action taken by another jurisdiction against the licensed cannabis operation. This includes any disciplinary action that is stayed pending appeal. Appeals are granted by cannabis industry regulators, and there are specific rules that need to be considered, so a state appeal occurs when regulators order it to be paused, so it doesn't go into effect during the appeal. All reporting required should be made in writing, either by mail or using the government regulator's online complaint form. Patient and caregiver duties. A medical patient or designated caregiver is required to notify government regulators upon learning that their registry identification card has been used fraudulently. If a patient or caregiver somehow learns that the medical cannabis registry was accessed without authorization, for example, healthcare professionals, etc., for any reason, they must also notify government regulators. After notifying government regulators about the fraudulent or unauthorized use of their registry identification card, a new identification card will be issued with a different registry number. Whenever a patient or caregiver has any change in their registry information, other than a change in their qualifying condition, they must notify regulators in a manner suitable to update the data that are required to be included. If a patient is deceased, the patient's caregiver or a legal representative will notify government regulators of their passing, and their registration in the medical patient registry will be deactivated at the request of caregiver or legal representative. Recommending physician. Patient's duty to report. A medical patient has the duty to report to government regulators of any conviction for an offense and/or arrests or charges that are pending, felony or misdemeanor offenses, or of their arrest and/or conviction in another legal jurisdiction that's essentially the same as a felony or misdemeanor offense. Caregiver's duty to report. A designated caregiver will have a duty to report any unlawful violations, regardless of the legal jurisdiction where the acts were committed, to government regulators, and this includes any offenses that involve operating a vehicle under the influence of alcohol or a controlled substance. This duty to report is not required for minor traffic violations such as parking violations, speeding tickets, and violations like failure to obey a red light or use a turn signal or expired registration, which does not need to be reported. If a patient has a caregiver who has the duty to report themselves to government regulators, they will use the required notification process outlined, using the forms for reporting. Duty to report conduct. Different duty to report categories include medical patient safety issues and designated caregiver events, observed impairment, incapacity or incompetent performance, and instances of professional misconduct, including but not limited to child abuse, sexual misconduct with patients or surrogates, controlled substance diversion, fraudulent billing, and other disruptive behavior. All of these categories of information include instances of harm to patients or circumstances that have a high risk of leading to patient harm. In addition to the oft-cited professional obligation to do no harm, healthcare providers, such as medical cannabis providers, also have various responsibilities to patients that fall under the purview of government regulators for compliance. Licensed professionals are involved in promoting the best interests of patients by preventing harm from occurring and by having the duty to report to remove those conditions that will lead to their harm. The duty to report is a fundamental way in which healthcare providers and others can fulfill the duties of beneficence by removing potentially harmful conditions. While responsibilities to report this information to medical boards and other relevant government regulators are outlined in cannabis industry legislation, we wish to highlight the importance of reporting relevant information that's already provided by medical boards. A healthcare system helps protect the public community, and with the cannabis industry being heavily regulated, professionals must always have the information readily available. It is essential to empower professionals to fulfill their duties, to protect and defend the rights of others, prevent harm, remove conditions that will cause harm, help persons with disabilities, and rescue persons in danger. Professional peers, the public community, healthcare systems, and cannabis industry regulators support the fulfillment of these duties by reporting instances of professional misconduct or incompetence. In addition to the duty to report any actions against their licensed employer or coworkers, there are duties that reside with the management team of licensed operations to self-report or cause a report to be made to government regulators. Management responsibilities. Whenever possible, the management team should be given primary responsibility for the investigation of any duty to report and its allegations. However, when a report is initially received by a supervisor and the professional does not do so anonymously, the initial responsibility for the duty to report review will be conducted with the supervisor who received it. Under this approach, supervisors conduct a preliminary inquiry to determine if grounds exist for initiating a full administrative investigation by government regulators. This preliminary assessment may include interviewing the report and/or any other witnesses for the alleged unprofessional conduct. If the supervisor's preliminary investigation discovers issues that may support a charge of misconduct, the supervisor should immediately notify government regulators of the information uncovered and the actions that are being undertaken. If the preliminary investigation reveals evidence of criminal conduct by an individual, all available information should be forwarded immediately, and the investigation should be turned over to the appropriate criminal investigative authority. In addition, the management team should consider whether the allegation, particularly if supported by evidence, may require notice to other appropriate law enforcement entities due to the seriousness of the unprofessional conduct made. Sometimes, the management team may help assist their employee during the duty to report investigation process for the alleged misconduct by providing additional information requested by government regulators. In doing so, typically government regulators will notify the involved management team of any actions that are required, where unusual circumstances or facts of the incident may warrant additional information requested. The overall purpose for allowing the management team to be involved during the duty to report process is to provide additional checks for any potential misinformation that may be provided by any parties involved, to make sure there's no failure during an investigation in a diligent manner. Corrective action measures. In the vast majority of cases, unprofessional conduct results in some type of corrective action that's implemented by the management team to include additional training, counseling, etc., may be a more useful option for an individual. For example, the individual may simply need a refresher on cannabis industry laws and other acts of professional mentoring to correct relatively minor problems. It is the management team who often ascertains specific measures that would be effective and appropriate to fix unprofessional conduct given the circumstances. Thus, in many licensed cannabis operations, the individual's immediate supervisor is given a major role during a duty to report investigative and disciplinary process. For example, first-line supervisors may be authorized to give the offending employee a verbal or written reprimand for minor infractions or for more serious infractions that will merit the action of a formal disciplinary process using law enforcement. Even in more serious instances, a supervisor may be asked to offer recommendations to government regulators for the disposition during the duty to report process. Involving the management team permits a more efficient and rational allocation of internal investigative manpower. Government agencies that adopt this or similar approaches should provide both cannabis industry regulators and licensed operations with general guidelines concerning these types of duty to report situations that must be handled appropriately as legally allowed. Community relations. Many members of the public community are unaware of how government regulators conduct their oversight of the cannabis industry and that there's a duty-to-report process that even exists. The need for increased transparency regarding the regulatory processes and ultimate disposition of any professional duty to report need to be even more apparent that allows for timely access and open dialogue with the public. Failure to address public complaints or involve the public in the duty-to-report process can result in individuals who have unprofessional conduct remaining in their positions of authority and continuing to abuse that authority. In addition, incidents of discriminatory behavior by individuals that are not identified and appropriately addressed could increasingly alienate large segments of the community. Public trust and confidence are built when the community perceives that unprofessional misconduct is addressed and corrected in the cannabis industry. This, in turn, promotes the public willingness to assist those operating in the cannabis industry to carry out their mission. In a climate that fosters trust and transparency between the public and the cannabis industry, citizens are more likely to feel the duty to report that will help provide evidence of unprofessional conduct and assist with reducing crime. Duty to report practices. Healthcare system duty to report. Anytime there is unprofessional conduct or evidence that appears to show that an individual is incompetent, guilty of negligence, guilty of a violation of the Medical Practice Act, engaging in inappropriate relationships with patients, is mentally or physically unable to practice safely, or has an alcohol or drug abuse problem needs to be reported. Despite the similar language being included in most legal jurisdictions' medical practice laws, there is evidence that demonstrates that reporting often does not occur. In a survey of 3,504 physicians, researcher Eric Campbell and his colleagues found that 96% of respondents agreed that physicians should report impaired or incompetent colleagues to relevant authorities, but only 45% of respondents who encountered such colleagues had not reported them. Concerning the duty to report not happening in the past when it should have, complaints have been raised concerning licensed healthcare professionals regularly ignoring reporting requirements, finding ways to circumvent them, or providing reports that are too brief and general to equip government regulators with relevant information for carrying out their functions. Regulators have reported having to resort to supplementing healthcare providers, threatening disciplinary action to obtain information, and resorting to professional sanctions. In some instances, failures to report by healthcare providers have resulted in additional avoidable adverse events to patients. Legal system duty to report. The duty to report misconduct is one of the ethical duties imposed on attorneys by the rules governing professional responsibility. With certain exceptions, an attorney who becomes aware that either a fellow attorney or a judge has committed an act in violation of the rules of ethical conduct must report that violation. Failure to do so subjects the attorney to fail to make the report to discipline. The duty extends only to actual knowledge possessed by an attorney, so an attorney who has a mere suspicion of misconduct is not required to report that suspicion, nor is the attorney required to conduct any sort of investigation to confirm or dispel that suspicion. The conduct at issue must rise to the level of misconduct under the rules of professional responsibility. Thus, an attorney who witnesses another attorney become intoxicated, engage in adultery, or gamble away a large sum of money is under no duty to report these acts because they are not prohibited by the rules of professional responsibility. Conduct that must be reported, on the other hand, includes matters such as breaching client confidentiality, misusing client funds, tampering with evidence, suborning perjury, offering bribes, and committing criminal acts of violence or dishonesty. Law enforcement duty to report. Law enforcement officers possess unique powers and discretion to take actions that require professional supervision, management, oversight, control, and adherence to a rigid code of conduct and professionalism. In response to this, law enforcement agencies must fully and completely investigate allegations of misconduct. The purpose of the duty to report is to inform all law enforcement offerings and the public community of procedures for accepting, processing, and investigating complaints concerning allegations of professional law enforcement misconduct. This policy defines provisions applicable only to the investigation and disposition of allegations of administrative misconduct. Law enforcement agencies will establish procedures for investigating complaints, and allegations of an officer's misconduct is crucial to demonstrate and protect an agency's integrity. If a complaint is received by a supervisor in the field, the supervisor should conduct a preliminary assessment to determine if grounds exist to conduct an administrative investigation. This preliminary assessment may include interviewing the complainant and/or any witnesses to the alleged misconduct. Through the development of duty-to-report policies and procedures to detect instances of law enforcement misconduct, an agency or officer can protect its reputation, promote public trust, ensure that heightened integrity remains a mainstay of the profession, and mitigate potential civil litigation. To be effective, internal investigation and disciplinary procedures must be consistently equitably applied to employees. Inconsistent discipline can undermine the entire disciplinary process and lead to charges of disparate treatment and civil litigation. Law enforcement agencies have the responsibility and duty to conduct internal investigations of allegations of misconduct, following the law and professionally accepted practices. Anyone who is the subject of an internal investigation retains certain rights, which may vary according to applicable law, but the characterization of the investigation will be either administrative or criminal, depending on the unprofessional conduct. Anonymous reporting. An inability to report anonymously in some jurisdictions may inhibit licensed professionals and members of the public community from making reports. This may also force professionals who exercise their duty to report to take reputational risks and jeopardize their interprofessional relations. It's always encouraged to adhere to the relevant laws that regulate all legal jurisdictions and fulfill a professional's duty to report, but making the process so they're anonymously reporting and avoiding being identified during hearing processes helps contribute to a culture that will encourage reporting of unprofessional conduct. As such, government regulators and control boards always help to ensure that appropriate protections are in place to enable professionals to report anonymously. When it is impossible to allow professionals to be anonymous when fulfilling their duty to report, or infeasible due to concerns about anyone who may want to make nefarious, frivolous, or vexatious complaints, it is essential that individual identities remain confidential and that licensees who had a report filed against them be discouraged from attempting to identify the professional who was reported. Duty to report summary. Government regulatory agencies establish duty-to-report policies and procedures for fully, fairly, and impartially investigating complaints and allegations of unprofessional conduct. Transparency of these procedures always aids in fostering trust with the public community and acceptance of the process by cannabis industry stakeholders. Government regulators always develop duty-to-report forms that allow professionals and the public to report alleged misconduct, along with identifying methods for internal or insider reporting, aka whistleblowers, of any misconduct. Professionals are provided with the opportunity to submit a duty to report in a variety of methods, for example, in person, by telephone, in writing, on the internet, etc. There is always a central authority with the government regulator's primary responsibility for conducting investigations of misconduct allegations that are identified. If reports are not submitted anonymously, the management team should be allowed to conduct preliminary assessments of any duty to report to determine if grounds exist to conduct an administrative investigation. However, government regulators always maintain the authority to assume responsibility for the investigation at any time. Individuals accused of misconduct should be interviewed as part of the investigation. All applicable warnings regarding compelled statements should be provided to the individual, and they should be allowed a legal representative to be present. Examinations and searches may be necessary as part of the investigation, and this may include breath, urine, or polygraph examinations, lineups, and/or searches of property belonging to the licensed cannabis operation. But government regulators will always consult their legal advisors regarding applicable restrictions. Once the investigation is complete, a final disposition will be determined by government regulators or the management team as appropriate for review and approval. If the investigation results in unfounded misconduct allegations against an individual, a formal document outlining the duty to report is typically provided to the individual, and they should be provided with an opportunity to review it. Where necessary, all corrective actions should be approved by government regulators or the management team and fully documented. All information related to the duty to report of alleged misconduct should be considered confidential and retained under secure conditions. Once the investigation is complete, a letter should be sent to all parties involved, explaining the final findings by government regulators. Thank you for viewing Duty to Report.